The Comanche Nation was once the most powerful in America and one of the most effective fighting forces in history. They fought off numerous foes and were only defeated in the late 19th century. Here's the secret story of the Comanche, the most powerful Native American tribe in history. The popular image of the Native American in the 19th century invariably shows them as invincible warriors who lived their lives on horseback. And while the Comanche definitely live up to this image, it wasn't always the case. The Comanche started as nomadic hunter-gatherers who moved to follow seasonal prey. In many ways, they lagged behind their peers. While the Aztec Empire was building incredible cities and the Iroquois were developing a sophisticated civilization, the Comanche built nothing and had no permanent settlements. They were also not particularly aggressive, which might have had to do with the fact that they were not notably good warriors. But all this changed in the late 17th century when the Comanche first encountered the horse. The Spanish introduced the animals to the Comanche, but the Native American tribe demonstrated an understanding of both how to master these incredible animals and how to translate that mastery into military force. Over the course of the next century, the hunter-gatherers of the Comanche Nation transformed into a dominant, aggressive empire of warriors, and it was all due to their expertise in breaking, training, riding, and fighting with the horse.
Instead of sedentary tribes who were agricultural from the east, you had nomadic tribes who were mounted in the west, and it changed everything.
For a tribe that had its beginnings as relatively peaceful hunter-gatherers, the Comanche's transformation into a military juggernaut was total. Once they gained mastery over horses, their culture became almost solely focused on waging war. Comanche society was very limited as a result. They didn't have a religious structure or many social organizations. There was no manufacturing or even art. Children learned how to ride, how to hunt, and how to fight from a very early age. Their entire lives were focused on those three aspects. In fact, the Comanches are sometimes compared to the Spartans in how they were almost totally focused on fighting. The Comanches evolved into a force of violence that no one could withstand. They waged war on everyone who came in contact with them, and they usually won. One reason for this success was their brutality. A Comanche raid was a terrifying affair. All male enemies would be killed without exception, even if they surrendered. Older children would be put to death as well. Young children would be taken captive, and the women would be assaulted and murdered. The Comanches waged total war long before the founding of the United States. In order to appreciate just how powerful and warlike the Comanches were at their height, you have to consider the fact that they came very close to wiping out several other native tribes. The Native Americans who resisted the expansion of the United States into the Midwest weren't a single culture. They were a diverse group of separate nations that shared certain cultural characteristics and traditions. The Comanches were particularly aggressive against their fellow Native Americans and particularly effective at killing them. They systematically pushed all the other tribes off the Central Plains, forcing them to find new lands to live within. In fact, the Comanches came very close to literally wiping out the entire Apache Nation. The warriors savagely defeated the weaker tribe in a series of conflicts that saw the desperate Apaches beg the Spanish for protection. Several large tribes within the Apache Nation disappeared as a result of the conflicts. But it wasn't just the Apaches. The Comanches inflicted severe damage on the Pawnees, the Osages, the Blackfeet, the Kiowas, and the Tankawas, driving them off their traditional lands and killing thousands of their people. By 1750, the Comanches had total control of the plains, and other Native American nations respected their borders. The territory controlled by the Comanche was called the Comancheria by the Spanish, and it grew with astonishing speed. After the transformation of their entire society into a mobile war machine, the Comanches began their rise to power as the lords of the plains. Over the course of about 150 years, the Comanche steadily drove out rival tribes, conquering land and subjugating everyone they didn't kill. When Americans began venturing west and finally brushed up against the Comancheria in the 1820s, it was massive. The Comanches controlled about 250,000 square miles, including land within what would become Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. They also had vassals, with about 20 other tribes acknowledging Comanche supremacy. According to historian Pekka Hamalainen, this makes the Comancheria something more than just a Native American tribe or nation. It made it an empire. They conquered lands and absorbed other ethnicities and cultures, imposed their own political and military structures, and negotiated as a single unit. In fact, the Comanche Empire was more powerful and more advanced than many of the European empires of the time. This is why the colonization efforts of the Spanish, French, and Americans were stalled whenever they pushed up against the Comancheria. What's remarkable about a lot of U.S. history is how the wars between the Comanches and the United States are often not described as wars at all. But make no mistake, the Comanches conducted a war against Texas that lasted nearly 40 years.
Got him on the run.
Don't be too sure. Looks like an old Indian trick to me.
It began when Texas was still under Spanish control, continued while it was an independent state, and finally as part of the U.S. The Texas Rangers were founded in part to defend settlers against the Comanches, and quickly adopted the total war approach that the Native American warriors practiced. But for decades, Texas couldn't stop the Comanches. In fact, they even expanded their territory into Texas on several occasions. It wasn't until Texas joined the United States and President Ulysses S. Grant made defeating the Comanches a priority that they were finally pushed back, setting off a series of events that culminated in their final defeat in the 1870s. A woman named Cynthia Ann Parker was kidnapped by Comanche raiders in 1836. She was assimilated into the tribe and eventually married and bore a son named Quanah Parker in 1852. By the time Quanah was an adult, the Comanche Nation was in its final death throes, and he was destined to be its last great leader. As a youthful warrior, Quanah was the epitome of Comanche bravery and fierceness. Remarkably young for a chief, Quanah led a series of violent raids against American forces in 1871 when he was just 19 years old. In 1874, Quanah gathered 300 Comanche warriors and launched a final assault on the American forces encroaching on the Comancheria. The chief intended to drive the Americans away once and for all, as the Comanche had always been able to do. They attacked a trading post called Adobe Walls, where about 28 hunters had taken shelter. Instead of a shocking victory, it turned into a slog. The siege lasted 5 days and ended with the Native Americans retreating. The Comanches continued to raid and slaughter, however, and American forces pursued, burning their supplies and killing their horses as they went. This broke the back of the Comanche Nation, and Quanah led his surviving warriors to surrender, agreeing to move to a reservation. Quanah proved to be a popular and capable peacetime leader. He spent the rest of his life serving his people as a peaceful chief of the Comanche Nation. By the 1870s, the Comanches were on the brink of defeat at the hands of American forces. There were several reasons the U.S. was having some success after decades of failure against the Lords of the Plains. The brutal fighting of the Civil War left the U.S. with an experienced and well-equipped modern fighting force. U.S. forces were slaughtering the Native Americans' primary food source, and President Ulysses S. Grant was determined to put an end to their power for once and for all. But there was another factor at work: disease. As with many other Native American tribes, the more they traded and interacted with U.S. settlers, the more they fell victim to diseases like smallpox and cholera. Having never encountered them before, the Comanches had no defense against them. Two widespread epidemics in 1816 and 1849 had reduced the Comanche population by half. In fact, one reason the Quahati Band, led by Quanah Parker, was still a formidable fighting force in the 1870s is because they had always disdained any sort of peaceful contact with settlers. Having shunned the Americans pushing west, they had avoided these plagues. This left them as one of the few remaining Comanche bands capable of resisting the U.S.'s march westward. For Native Americans, putting dinner on the table was a terrifying, oftentimes death-defying, and always full-time job. While many other foods aren't even around anymore, others have cropped up as trending new dining options. This is what Native Americans ate every day before Europeans came. While the Clovis likely weren't the first people to set foot on American soil, they were responsible for some of the earliest settlements. And they were such good hunters, they've been blamed for the mass extinction of one of their favorite meals, the mammoth. The rise of the Clovis does coincide with the downfall of the mammoths, along with other Pleistocene megafauna. Bones found across 19 Clovis sites suggest that while they were eating a lot of mammoth, they were also eating bison, mastodon, deer, rabbits, and caribou. Their diet depended greatly on what was nearby, and megafauna seems to be the overwhelming preference. Clovis hunters in Mexico stalked the gomphotheres. As seen from this small section of a gomphothere jaw, they were massive elephant-like creatures. They also went extinct during this period. In the far north, they hunted something even more surprising: camels. Camels roamed wide sections of what's now Canada until the Clovis likely hunted them to extinction. The Folsom people lived in the area of the Great Plains from around 9000 to 8000 BCE. Given the sheer number of knives, blades, and distinct leaf-shaped projectiles they left behind, it's clear they were more hunters than gatherers. The extinction of the mammoth forced later peoples to find something else to hunt, and that new prey ended up being bison. Because bison are faster, lighter, and smaller than mammoths, new technology, like the pointed projectiles used by the Folsom, were developed to make hunting more efficient. The Folsom didn't use spears like the Clovis before them. Instead, they hunted with arrows and darts. The Folsom people were so dependent on bison as a food source, they became migratory, following the great herds across the plains of North America. These bison weren't what we think of today. They were Bison antiquus, a massive, now extinct ancestor of the modern-day bison. Bison antiquus were 15 feet long, stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder, and had horns with a 3-foot span. Compare these ancient beasts to modern-day bison, which are around 10 feet long, and you'll have a whole new appreciation for the Folsom who hunted these massive creatures with bows and arrows. Somewhere between 7000 and 4500 BCE, the Plano culture emerged. In addition to their diet, which consisted primarily of bison, they were defined by their hunting techniques, traditions, and the development of an innovative food preservation method. The Plano hunted entire herds of bison at a time. They transitioned from hunting a single animal to using a method known as the buffalo jump, where large groups of hunters herded bison off the edge of a cliff. Because of the preservation techniques they invented, the Plano were able to store all of the meat for extended periods of time. The meat was dried in the sun, then mixed with seeds, berries, and fat. They would then pack this mixture into the animal's intestines, making a prehistoric sausage called pemmican. Unfortunately for the Plano, shifts in weather patterns on the plains resulted in the reduction of herd numbers. With fewer bison to hunt, the entire society started to fade until the Plano people ultimately disappeared forever. The Yurok are a native people that are actually still around in the 21st century. In many respects, they still hold on to their old ways of living. This includes a continued reliance on the same food sources they've utilized for generations.
We have a family hold down the way here that my ancestors have fished since the beginning of time.
The tribe has traditionally lived on the Klamath River along the coast of California. They have relied on foods like seaweed, mussels, salmon, sturgeon, and candlefish as the backbone of their diet. They've also drawn from the land, hunting deer and elk, but also thriving on acorns, berries, and a variety of teas. The Yurok have even been known to consume banana slugs. Even today, the Yurok still harvest from the same mussel beds and wild salmonberry bushes they have for generations, and they're hoping to teach future generations to do the same. The Poverty Point Heritage Center is located in Louisiana, and it's said that at about the same time Stonehenge was being built, Native Americans were moving around 2 million cubic yards of dirt to build massive mounds, earthworks, and circles. The Poverty Point site was mysteriously abandoned around 1100 BCE, but the earthworks and traces of the builders' everyday lives remained. Most of these native people's food came from the water. Fish was their primary protein source. However, archaeologists have also discovered traces of nuts, aquatic plants, and tubers. And because no signs of agriculture have been discovered at the sites, it's believed that they were strictly hunter-gatherers. Based on the remains discovered in the area, it's likely that the people of Poverty Point hunted freshwater fish, turtles, snakes, alligators, frogs, and small mammals like rabbits and squirrels. Bones of waterfowl such as ducks and geese have also been discovered at many of the sites. The Anasazi are best known for their incredible cave dwellings chiseled out of the rocks in the American Southwest, but they are notable for other reasons as well. These ancient Americans developed a society that helped bridge the gap from being hunter-gatherers to utilizing more modern agricultural technology. Around 1200 BCE, human beings began settling the region of the Southwest. The territory they occupied was large enough to grow crops. At first, they focused on corn, and they didn't just grow it. They selectively crossbred crops in order to create new, hardier varieties. By 500 BCE, the Anasazi were also growing beans and later added squash to their diet. These vegetables were supplemented with the meat from rabbits and deer. It's also worth noting that they were experts at sun-drying their food. Most of their veggies were sun-dried, and in the early years of their society, they would store the results in baskets. As the Anasazi matured, they turned to pottery for their food storage needs. Traditional game and vegetables might not have been the only food the Anasazi fed on. Historical records show signs that the Anasazi eventually started to descend into anarchy. Leadership dispatched squads to keep the peace as villages turned on each other. Eventually, village rivalries turned into massacres that ended in mass slaughter and even cannibalism. These horrors lasted for centuries, even after the arrival of the Spanish. Between 100 BCE and 500 CE, the region of the North American continent that became the USA was dominated by a group of related cultures known collectively as the Hopewell. These Native Americans were also connected to a vast trade network that went all the way into Yellowstone. The results of this trading were that while many localities had their own diets, which often included deer, fish, nuts, seeds, and berries, they also had access to goods from other regions. While it's not clear how much was traded and how much was brought in from seasonal migrations, we do know that local goods were often found very far from home. The Yellowstone area, for example, was a source of bighorn sheep and obsidian, while the Great Lakes supplied copper and silver. The Appalachian regions had mica and steatite, much of which was used for tools. This made it possible to carry out the kind of agriculture that allowed mass production of things like tobacco, sunflowers, and knotweed. This was a huge revolution because the agriculture that defined the Hopewell marked the official shift of Native American culture into full agricultural societies. It's not clear where the Oneota came from, but we do know that they settled along the northern Mississippi River and its tributaries. Given that one of the tools most commonly associated with them are stone scrapers used for cleaning buffalo hides, it's a safe assumption that they hunted a lot of buffalo. The Oneota appeared around 1150 CE and faded away after coming into contact with French trappers. During the height of their society, they survived by hunting bison and deer and occasionally elk. They were also adept at growing corn, beans, and squash. The Oneota relied heavily on plants that are largely considered weeds today. Goosefoot and pigweed were major dietary staples, and though it's not common anymore, they were also known to have eaten dogs. We know all of this because the Oneota stored many of their perishable food staples in deep, bell-shaped pits that were covered with logs and hides to keep scavengers out. This also helped keep the food fresh, and consequently has provided a treasure trove of information to archaeologists. The Fort Walton culture is the name given to the people who flourished around northern Florida and the Mississippi River Delta in the centuries leading up to the European occupation starting around 1200 CE. They emerged after a group called the Weeden Island culture, and for the most part, they gravitated toward living in and around swamps and lakes. One of the things they were particularly good at was making ceramics. Their pottery vessels were tempered with shells, and that was needed for cooking the large amounts of corn that they grew. This corn was different from what we're used to eating today. It was small, with kernels so hard it gained the nickname flint corn. It was mostly used to make hominy, hence the importance of the cooking vessels. Fishing and seafood were also a major part of life, as was something called the black drink. Made from yappan holly, it wasn't made for consumption, but rather for purging the stomach as part of a ritual leading to the eating of green corn. Interestingly, the drink didn't actually induce vomiting. Instead, the vomiting was a learned behavior associated with the drink. When you think of America's prehistoric mound builders, you're probably thinking of the Cahokia. They were at the apex of their power between 1050 and 1200 CE. At the height of their society, the Cahokia Mounds complex had tens of thousands of residents, and all of those people needed to eat. The Cahokia absolutely revered the hardworking farmers that kept the masses fed. Farmers were respected for good reason, because they cultivated and domesticated crops like the bottle gourd, squash, knotweed, and sunflowers. The Cahokia weren't so different from us in a major way. They absolutely needed their caffeine pick-me-up. Analysis of residue left on Cahokia drinking cups show that they loved casina. Casina is a type of tea made from a native holly that comes with a healthy dose of caffeine. It was so popular that once Europeans did show up, they documented its widespread daily use. In 2017, artist Roxanne Swenzel spoke about a project she'd been working on for a while, a cookbook based on the ancient traditional foods of the Pueblo, updated for a modern audience. She did it in the hope of helping alleviate the pain of some of the chronic health problems plaguing Native Americans of the 21st century. The traditional diet she spoke of consisted of deer, elk, buffalo, antelope, and bighorn sheep. Then there were the plants that were gathered, which included teas, berries, roots, and mushrooms. As far as farming, she utilized ingredients like beans, squash, and corn. Swenzel recruited a group of people who agreed to eat nothing but traditional Pueblo foods for 3 months. Most of the volunteers had chronic health issues like diabetes and high cholesterol. The results were impressive, to say the least.
We had no idea how successful this would be. Things that the doctors had told us couldn't ever be fixed were gone.
Geronimo is one of the most notable Native Americans who ever lived. His story has been told on screens big and small, and shouting his name is synonymous with having no fear. But how much do you really know about him? People who knew Geronimo at a young age could be forgiven if they didn't think he would grow up to be remembered by history. For one thing, his given birth name was Goyukla, which means one who yawns. His grandfather had been an Apache chief, but when his father joined his mother's tribe when they married, that effectively removed Geronimo from any hereditary leadership position in either tribe. He became a great leader of warriors while still in his 20s, but he was never a tribal chief. According to Smithsonian Magazine, he bristled whenever he was called a chief by ignorant white people, which happened often. Tradition holds that Goyukla received his better-known moniker after a particularly brutal battle. However, historians disagree whether it was because Mexican soldiers were mispronouncing Goyukla, or if they were praying aloud to St. Jerome for mercy in the face of his ruthless attack. When Geronimo reached manhood, he married a woman named Alope. In his autobiography, he said that marrying her was, quote, the greatest joy. They were very happy together, and she bore him 3 children. The Apache typically traveled in bands to trade with other tribes and the people across the Mexican border. They would leave the women and children in a secure encampment a short distance away with a few warriors to protect them in case of emergency. While in Mexico on one such trading mission, Mexican troops attacked and looted the Apache encampment, slaughtering nearly everyone there while the men were away. Geronimo returned to discover that he had lost his entire living family, his wife, his mother, and all 3 of his children. The attack on the Apache was in retaliation for earlier raids against the Mexicans, though it's very possible that Geronimo hadn't actually taken part in them. When he told his life story, he didn't shy away from admitting to other raids, but he never mentioned participating in any before the massacre of his family. The end result was nevertheless the same, as Geronimo developed a visceral hatred for Mexicans that drove him for much of his life. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the overt hostilities of the Mexican-American War.
The best treaty in the world, who?
What, are you stupid? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Who wants to party?
Some of the terms dictated that America would protect Mexico from attacks by native tribes crossing over their common borders. Mexico also expected the U.S. to compensate it financially for the damage incurred during raids that got through. The U.S. never much cared about marauding bands attacking Mexico, much less making any monetary reparations to their victims. But that all changed with the Gadsden Purchase of 1854. This was a section of land nearly 30,000 square miles in size, which now forms Mexico's border with present-day Arizona and part of New Mexico. It overlapped significantly with the Apache homeland. The U.S. purchased it from Mexico for $10 million in order to expand the transcontinental railroad through the Southwest. Since any disturbances in this area were now happening on U.S. soil, the government suddenly took an interest in Geronimo and the Apache. They were determined to round them up and put them on reservations out of the way, or quote-unquote civilize them by forcing them to adopt the ways of white people. When white men began appearing on his people's lands, Geronimo considered them an improvement over the Mexicans. The Apache were peaceful, making treaties and exchanging gifts, but the white men were treacherous and looked for reasons to betray them. One such incident occurred when a peaceful meeting between the Apache chief Cochise and Lieutenant George N. Bascom turned out to be a trap. Cochise escaped by cutting a hole in a tent and evading the soldiers who had surrounded him, and Geronimo and other Apache helped him get back his captured tribesmen and settle the score. But the U.S. Army was relentless in its pursuit and determination to round up all of the Apache, as they had done with Sitting Bull and the Sioux in 1881. Eventually, Geronimo grew tired of always being chased, and with the help of scouts working with the Army against their own people, his band of Apache was captured and sent to the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona in 1886. Geronimo hated the restrictions the reservation placed on him. He made 3 attempts to break out from the reservation, but ultimately none were successful. When he surrendered for the 3rd and last time, it effectively brought the Apache's organized resistance against the U.S. government to an end. After Geronimo surrendered, President Grover Cleveland wrote to his Secretary of War that he didn't see any point in treating him as anything but an ordinary prisoner of war. As he put in his telegram, "I hope nothing will be done with Geronimo which will prevent our treating him as a prisoner of war, if we cannot hang him, which I would much prefer." It was decided to move the Apache to more neutral ground where local tempers didn't run quite as hot. The warriors were shipped off to restore the abandoned Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida, where they would be imprisoned and treated as tourist attractions for a few years. Meanwhile, their families were sent to Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, where they were forced into cramped quarters. Many of the children, meanwhile, were shipped off to be forcefully assimilated into white society. The families were eventually reunited and later moved to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where they were permitted to recreate their tribal way of life as best as they could. In his autobiography, Geronimo described how the land was unsuitable for his people, but he agreed to stay, hoping that, for once, white men wouldn't mistreat him or his people. Geronimo's later years saw him participating in activities that weren't particularly dignified. At the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, for example, he was considered the perfect attraction to symbolize the taming of the West. He exhibited his skills with bow and arrow and signed autographs for 10 cents apiece as he posed with Apache crafts. He also took part in Wild West shows where he staged a buffalo hunt that would end with him missing the kill, requiring that the beast be then finished off by white cowboys. Geronimo eventually passed away on February 17, 1909. He had arranged to get some whiskey after selling some bows and arrows and fell off his horse when riding home that evening. He lay on the ground all night before he was discovered and developed pneumonia as a result. He died within the week, a sad end for a legendary figure.
Hawaiians are a proud people with strong traditions, but what was their country like before the United States showed up and took it away? here's a look at what pre-American Hawaii was really like. According to legend, when the first Polynesian explorers discovered Hawaii sometime prior to 600 AD, they discovered a series of advanced temples, roads, dams, and fish ponds that had been built by the island's original inhabitants. Just who those inhabitants were, though, is a mystery. Some believe they were a legendary race of little people called the Menehune, who lived deep in the forest and only emerge at night to build their fantastic structures in a single evening before returning to hiding. Others think this legend is simply a recent construct. The name Menehune seems to be a corruption of the less flattering Manahune, which means the lowly people, instead of the little people. Some think Tahitian settlers around the year 1000 AD pinned this derisive nickname on the island's original inhabitants, while others think it was the Europeans in the 18th century, and that the whole little people legend was a corruption of European tales of elves and gnomes. Whatever the case, it seems someone lived on Hawaii before the Polynesians arrived. Who they were and where they went, though, is something we may never learn. Anyone who has seen Moana has a good idea of how the Polynesian explorers first found Hawaii. Crowding into 50-foot-long double-hulled canoes, the Polynesians spread across the Pacific for millennia, sailing with the help of stars and by closely observing ocean swells and bird flight paths. The second wave of colonizers arrived around 1000 AD, and they hailed from Tahiti, 2,400 miles from Hawaii as the crow flies. The Tahitians reportedly subdued the already settled populace and conquered the islands for themselves, giving rise to what would become a rigid class system and a relatively sophisticated form of government in which the chief class reigned supreme, and the regular people had to do their bidding. The Polynesians stopped arriving in Hawaii around 1300 AD. In fact, they stopped taking long oceanic voyages entirely. The reason for the cessation has long been a mystery, but some scholars suggest that the Polynesians had been taking advantage of favorable wind patterns, and that when those patterns changed, they no longer had the wind at their back. Like India, Hawaiian society developed into a rigid caste system. Everyone in Hawaiian society had a defined role to play based on the circumstances of their birth. At the top was the king, who belonged to the ali'i, or chief class. The king had a number of privileges that went with this rank. For example, he collected taxes and headed up religious rites and festivals. He also led armies in battle. Other members of the chiefly class, who were said to have descended from the gods, were the children of people whom they considered superior. Some earned their way into the class by being exceptionally strong or skilled. Others married into it. Regardless, the king had the final say. Next in the hierarchy were the kahuna, a rank made up of priests and craftsmen whose skills were much sought after. The rest of the people were called the maka'ainana. These were the common people who farmed, fished, paid taxes to the king, and served in his army. They were allowed to keep only a third of their goods and pay. The rest went to the king. And at the very bottom were the kawa, or outcasts. Sadly, the kawa were often prisoners of war. After their capture, they were either enslaved, given the most thankless and difficult of the farm labor, or used in human sacrifice. For hundreds of years, ancient Hawaiians lived by a very strict code of religious and social laws called kapu, which enforced the caste system. The rules, laws, and mores of kapu depended on men and women remaining within their birth-based station in life, and these guidelines were supposedly handed down by the gods in the spirits of the ancestors. Kapu dictated, among many other things, what the specific genders could eat, what body parts of a chief a common person could come in contact with, and what color of feathers certain people could wear. Those who violated kapu were often sentenced to death. The all-encompassing power of kapu began to dwindle as more and more Westerners arrived on the island. Islanders noticed, for instance, that British explorers lived in hourly violation of kapu and lived to tell the tale. According to the Journal of Polynesian Society, Liho, also known as Kamehameha II, son to one of Hawaii's most powerful and beloved kings, King Kamehameha the Great, effectively blew up the system in 1819 by eating in public with a woman, which was taboo under kapu. Like the Polynesians before him, Captain James Cook is said to have discovered the Hawaiian Islands by accident. In 1778, his crew came to Waimea Bay on the island of Kauai at the time of Makahiki, a period of peace and prosperity, and they were treated well by the natives. It didn't hurt that Cook and his men, having come from Tahiti, were somewhat well versed in island hospitality. The British sailors greeted the Hawaiians with gifts, and according to the Coffee Times, the islanders responded by granting 3 days' worth of adult favors. A second encounter 10 months later on the Big Island went swimmingly too, probably because Cook again arrived during Makahiki. The third time, though, was most definitely not the charm. Cook tried to set sail for the north in early February 1779, but had to return to shore to repair his ship. Tensions rose, and a boat was stolen from the British. Cook then attempted to take the king hostage to force the islanders to return his boat. Instead, they attacked him. Cook and 4 of his sailors were killed in the fight. Cook's death also coincided with the rise of a new power in Hawaii, King Kamehameha the Great. Likely born sometime around 1736, Kamehameha defeated his cousin in a bitter civil war that ended in 1782 with Kamehameha ascendant. By 1791, he had subdued the entire Big Island, and in 1795 he conquered Maui and Oahu with the help of Western muskets and cannons. The last holdout to his reign capitulated in 1810 when the Hawaiian Islands were finally united under one government, King Kamehameha's. Despite Cook's violent demise, Hawaii soon became a popular destination for European and American ships sailing through the Pacific. Not only was it well situated for a mid-voyage pit stop, the islands also had a wealth of rare sandalwood, which was especially coveted in China. A booming economy soon emerged, with traders swapping sandalwood in China for silk and porcelain, which they then sold in America for incredible profit. It seemed for a while to be a win-win-win, but it wasn't long before Hawaiians began suffering the consequences of the sandalwood boom. Native sandalwood cutters were exploited as cheap labor and began dying from harsh conditions and overwork. The sandalwood forest dwindled, meaning workers had to go further and further up the mountains to find trees to cut. According to Keola magazine, at one point, Hawaiian parents started pulling sandalwood trees from the ground to save their children from the sad fate of being a sandalwood cutter. As a result, the trade eventually died out. Prior to the arrival of Europeans and Americans, Hawaii was a land of mostly unexploited natural resources, with the locals particularly taking pride in the vast numbers of whales that flourished in the seas nearby. Unfortunately, that changed in the early 1800s, and the results were devastating for Hawaii. Whalers from New England flocked to the island in great numbers. They mostly wanted whales, but while they were on the islands, they wanted other things too, like fun and food, leading to prostitution, gambling, and upheaval of the local farming and fishing cultures. And chasing after the whalers came another wave of visitors, Christian missionaries who were trying to stop the whalers. That led to violence, and eventually a fort was built to protect the locals from the rampaging whalers. That in turn was replaced by a jail, which again was focused on locking up whalers. This cycle continued until 1859 when oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, eventually leading to the demise of the whaling industry, a little too late for Hawaiians and for their whales. The people that benefited the most from the unruly whalers were those missionaries. They began arriving around 1820, right after Kapu, the ancient Hawaiian system of religious practices and social norms, had been effectively abolished. It was perfect timing. And the Christians who sailed to Hawaii at the beginning of the 19th century were incredibly effective in their efforts to sway native islanders to their cause. By promising to protect Hawaiians from an unruly and often violent invasion of whalers, they assembled congregations in no time, convincing locals that Jesus was more powerful than the old gods with their now abandoned Kapu rules. Soon, even the descendants of King Kamehameha the Great were worshiping in one of their churches. The legacy of the Christian missionaries in Hawaii is a checkered one. Their arrival almost certainly helped strip power from the native chiefs and kings and spurred the effort to claim Hawaii for the United States. But on the plus side, they also helped create the written Hawaiian language, which allowed the Hawaiian people to preserve aspects of their culture that otherwise may have been irretrievably lost in the waves of colonization. Hawaii's economy saw a number of fluctuations following the arrival of the Westerners. First, there was the sandalwood boom, then came whaling. When the whaling industry went under, Christian missionaries working to save souls on the islands quickly changed course and began buying up all the land for another cash crop, sugarcane. Hawaii's climate was perfect for growing the sweet stuff, and the God-fearing businessmen went planting so much sugarcane that they had trouble finding enough men to cut it. According to the Grove Farm Sugar Plantation Museum, one of Hawaii's oldest sugarcane plantations, Hawaii's sugarcane farmers benefited not only from Hawaii's wet climate, but from the American Civil War, which ravaged southern crops, creating a market for island ones. Eventually, Hawaii would support what many called the Big Five sugarcane growers, and the heads of these five firms didn't stop at sugar production. They became savvy politicians, managing in a relatively short amount of time to take power away from the native Hawaiians and put it in the hands of the island's white minority population. As Time put it, by virtue of interlocking directorates and interlocking marriages, the Big Five controlled wholesale and retail businesses, agriculture, banks, land, shipping, society, everything. Next time you enjoy a Dole pineapple, just keep in mind the company exists because the Dole family overthrew the rightful government of Hawaii. While white businessmen were trying to consolidate power in Hawaii, the nation's ruler, Queen Leli'iokolone, was battling to protect her people and their traditions. Born Lydia Kamakaeha in 1838, she became ruler in 1891 when her brother King Kalakaua died. She quickly worked to implement a new constitution that would both restore her power as monarch and also re-enfranchise the poorer classes which had been shut out of power. That wouldn't do for the rich white businessmen in Hawaii, who plotted a coup to overthrow the Queen in hopes that it would force the United States to annex the island nation. Attempts to stop the coup were hampered when the U.S. Marines intervened on the side of the coup leaders. Unable to face the military might of America, the Queen was overthrown in 1893 and arrested for treason by the new ruler of Hawaii, Sanford Dole, whose cousin would then cash in by founding the Dole Pineapple Empire. A gifted poet and songwriter, the Queen wrote a book about the ordeal called Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen. Imprisoned and faced with the imminent execution of her most loyal supporters, the Queen was forced to sign official abdication papers in 1895 in order to spare their lives. 3 years later, at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. officially annexed Hawaii in order to secure it as a naval base, exactly what Dole and the other conspirators had hoped for when they planned their coup. In 1959, Hawaii finally became a U.S. state, but the past hasn't been forgotten, and efforts to restore to the native people a voice in their own governance continue to this day.
The story of the Lewis and Clark expedition feels as old as time, specifically the time of the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson roughly doubled the size of the United States by buying the Louisiana Territory from France. This largely uncharted land spanned about 828,000 square miles and eventually became 15 states. That vast expanse needed to be surveyed, thus beginning the historic adventure of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. But it likely would have been a horrific misadventure if it weren't for their heroic Shoshone guide and bilingual translator, Sacajawea. Born sometime in the vicinity of 1788, Sacajawea was kidnapped around age 12. She and another Shoshone captive were sold to French-Canadian fur trader Toussaint Charbonneau, who declared them to be his wives. 2 months after giving birth to her first child, Sacajawea embarked on the Lewis and Clark expedition with her infant son in tow. She used her mastery of the Hidatsa and Shoshone languages to help negotiate vital horse trades and relay other important information. Sacajawea and her baby may have been the only things preventing Native Americans in the area from perceiving the expedition as a hostile invasion. But she wasn't just an important resource, she was also a rescuer. When a storm threatened to capsize their boat and an expedition member threatened to shoot Charbonneau, Sacajawea saved the day by gathering important instruments, garments, and documents. Somehow, she achieved this feat while simultaneously taking care of her infant son. Survival didn't come easy for the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Rain and treacherous terrain conspired against them as they braved the terrifyingly slippery Rocky Mountains. While situated 300 feet above the Missouri River, Meriwether Lewis took a 20-foot tumble that could have become a much longer drop had he not stopped himself. A year later, he slipped in a narrow pass and narrowly avoided falling 90 feet into the river. Luckily for Sacajawea, she had lived around and was familiar with the Rockies. She navigated the danger of the terrain, but helped her fellow travelers traverse the Bozeman Pass in the mountains of Montana. While fending off water and gravity, the group also came under attack from bacteria, insects, and disease. Tainted jerky wreaked digestive havoc. At least 3 men came down with syphilis, and some historians suspect that Lewis suffered from the disease. In June 1805, Sacajawea contracted a nasty illness. For almost a week, she had a weak pulse, strong fever, and respiratory problems. Some medical historians have interpreted those symptoms as a sign Sacajawea was grappling with gonorrhea or chronic pelvic inflammatory disease. Whatever the truth of the illness was, she overcame it just like other obstacles. Sacajawea has been afforded a significant role in history, memorialized to the point that she's become a near-mythic figure. Not that that's always a good thing.
That is not my name. No.
Second a box.
No.
In fact, she's so memorialized that somehow she has 2 different graves located hundreds of miles apart. At the Wind River Indian Reservation near Fort Washakie, Wyoming, a massive granite tombstone purports to mark the final resting place of Sacajawea. If so, then she died in 1884 at the ripe old age of 100. However, that tombstone may be gravely mistaken, because about 600 miles away is another grave near Mobridge, South Dakota that claims to be Sacagawea's final resting place. And if the burial marker is to be believed, then she didn't even reach age 30, instead dying in December 1812 at around 24 or so years old. William Clark wrote in his diary that Sacajawea died long before 1884. He adopted her 2 children in 1813, suggesting that Sacajawea wasn't around to raise them. Based on the age listed at Wind River, Sacajawea would have been 21 when she traveled with Lewis and Clark, creating a clear inconsistency with other biographical details. Given the timing of the adoption, it would make sense if she perished in 1812. And expert James Ronda asserted that most scholars currently believe that she was at least deceased by the time Clark documented it in his journal, sometime between 1825 and 1828. So how did this supermom and seemingly natural-born survivor expire? Some researchers theorize that she succumbed to a serious illness that plagued her throughout her adult life and may have been exacerbated by the birth of her second child, Lizette. History writes that she might have died of typhoid fever. Whatever the cause of her death, it's hard to imagine that she knew she'd be so remembered in the centuries to come.
Native American warrior women led their tribes into battle, negotiated peace with the United States, served as diplomats, and more, but they don't get the recognition they rightly deserve. Here are the stories of several of the most famous Native American warrior women. Colesta, a wife of Chief Kamiakin, is most famous for fighting by his side armed with a stone war club in the Battle of Fort Lakes. But she was also a talented medicine woman in her own right, and someone that many believed had psychic and mystical powers. When Chief Kamiakin was injured in battle, she was able to nurse him back to health using her medical knowledge. Many Native American cultures believe in psychic abilities, but this belief is largely misunderstood. Often, psychic abilities relate to knowledge passed down from person to person or the wisdom that a person holds. While she's often mentioned as one of the most famous warrior women, little is known about Colesta. After she died in 1865, Chief Kamiakin returned to his ancestral lands, where he later died in 1877. Kamiakin had 5 wives, many of them from different tribes. This may have aided their efforts to maintain peace. Pine Leaf, also known as Woman Chief or Fallen Leaf, was born in 1806 to the White Clay tribe. She was taken as a prisoner by the Crow tribe in 1816 by a father who had lost his son. It was fairly common for tribal members to adopt children in this way. She was only 10 at the time, but her new family raised her with a warrior's skills. Using her training, she killed 2 men in her first battle and captured several horses. Accomplishing such a violent victory, she was able to make a name for herself at an early age. Pine Leaf was considered a two-spirit, an individual who embraced both traditional male and female roles. Though she wore female clothing, she pursued male interests almost exclusively, and when she eventually became Woman Chief, she married 4 wives. Pine Leaf was eventually killed by the White Clay tribe, her people by birth, in 1854, but she became a mythical figure, not only as a woman chief, but also as both a warrior and negotiator. During her tenure as chief, she was able to broker peace treaties with surrounding tribes, even though her end was a violent one. Buffalo Calf Road Woman was a Cheyenne warrior who became renowned after the Battle of Rosebud. She's one of the most famous Native American warriors, known for saving her brother during the battle and being the only woman in her tribe to fight in the Battle of Little Bighorn. In fact, some people believe that Buffalo Calf Road Woman may have been instrumental in General George Custer's defeat. The Northern Cheyenne tribe's oral history recounts that Buffalo Calf Road Woman knocked Custer off his horse, leaving him vulnerable. According to a Cheyenne elder, they were to keep silent for 100 summers regarding that fateful day, which has obscured some of the facts. This silence was declared because the tribe feared retribution from the U.S. government. Contemporary accounts of the time not only placed Buffalo Calf Road Woman at the battle, but observed that she was the only woman there armed with a revolver. This is key evidence, as several other people who claim to have killed Custer were not armed with a gun, and the doomed general is believed to have been killed by a bullet. Either way, she was almost definitely instrumental in the battle. Moving Robe Woman was also known as her Eagle Robe or Married Crawler. As a young adult, she witnessed her brother, One Hawk, fall in battle, and then she saw her father, Crawler, preparing to fight. Upon seeing his bravery, she braided her hair and painted her face red, then mounted a horse and rode directly into the fray. She was one of the women who fought against General George Custer during the Battle of Little Bighorn, and like Buffalo Calf Road Woman, some believe she may have been the one who killed him. One warrior claims to have held Custer's arms as she stabbed him in the back. However, the details are murky to Custer's final moments, and it's unlikely that the truth will ever be revealed. Moving Robe Woman did reportedly kill one of Custer's men, Isaiah Dorman, in revenge for her brother's death. Little is known of what happened to Moving Robe Woman after these historic battles, but she was photographed in her 80s as Married Crawler in a photo held by the Smithsonian Institution. So, though she may or may not have played a role in any major battles thereafter, she did live a long and proud life. Running Eagle's story is a compelling one, blending historical fact with mysticism. Running Eagle was also known as Brown Weasel Woman, and she was born into the Blackfoot Nation in the 1800s, but she became more interested in what were considered male interests such as hunting than female pursuits. She went on hunts for buffalo and once saved her father's life when they were ambushed by enemies. Ultimately, she became a successful hunter and warrior. After seeing her husband killed by a Crow tribe member, she spoke with the sun, which told her that she would be a fierce warrior if she never lay with another. The waterfall that she had this vision quest at is now marked as a historical site. Running Eagle did in fact become a warrior leader and conducted multiple raids. In one such raid, she was able to capture 600 horses. Eventually, she was killed during a raid on the Flathead Indians. As the story goes, some believe that she was killed when she broke her promise to the sun and slept with a man from her party. During the Bannock War, Sarah Winnemucca served as both scout and messenger. Of the Paiute tribe, she fought for the Native American land rights following the war. When her people were exiled to reservations in which they began to die of diseases, she testified before Congress. She lectured over 300 times about the injustice her people faced. Born sometime around 1844, she grew up and began working as an interpreter for Indian affairs in 1871. In 1878, she began working as an interpreter and a scout during the Bannock War. In one story, it's reported that she was able to save her father by traveling over 200 miles without sleep. Sarah was most notable for straddling the line between her tribal origins and her work with the United States. She was a peacemaker and desired for both sides to come to an agreement. Unfortunately, this didn't ultimately come to pass. In 1883, she wrote Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims, but the Paiute tribe was not allowed to return to its land despite congressional legislation. DeTest rode with her husband and eventually joined Geronimo's band. She was known for being an aggressive and lethal warrior, but she also worked to translate, negotiate, and mediate. Many Native American warrior women are remembered for being both warriors and diplomats, and DeTest was part of this group. In fact, some say that DeTest and Lozin, another famous Apache warrior, were in a relationship. While they did fight together and were arrested together, there is little evidence to support the claim that they were in a romantic relationship. However, they were close, and an interviewer noted that DeTest mourned Lozin's death until the day she died. DeTest, like Lozin, is believed to have been two-spirit. She dressed and fought like a man for much of her life. DeTest proved herself on the battlefield, fought side by side with other women, and survived her encounters with the settlers. With the nickname Apache Joan of Arc, it shouldn't come as a surprise that Lozin was known as a feared and fearless leader. She was both a medicine woman and a warrior, and was rumored to have incredible powers. She traveled with both Geronimo and DeTest. Before that, she defended her lands with her brother against the U.S. Army. Before battles, the Apache would often pray for guidance. Lozin had the uncanny ability to use these prayer sessions to tell exactly where the enemy might be. Thus, she was known to be an excellent strategist. She also excelled at both riding and shooting. Lozin spent years in skirmishes and raids, eventually falling in with Geronimo until he surrendered in 1885. She was battle sisters with other Apache women, including DeTest. After repeatedly coming to blows with the U.S. Army in battle, Lozin was taken prisoner. She died of tuberculosis in Alabama. Awashonks was the chief of the Sacanet people in what is now Rhode Island. Born around 1620 and most active in the 1670s, Awashonks would eventually become one of the signatories of a peace treaty between the local tribes and Plymouth Colony. It's not known what her real name was. Awashonks was a granted title that meant she who is queen. When her husband died in 1660, she became the leader, but it's also believed that she held the position because of her strength and wisdom. She would eventually marry 2 husbands and have 3 children. Awashonks participated in King Philip's War, which is when she appears most frequently in records. She initially supported Metacomet's fight against the British colonizers, but then switched sides in a deal to protect her people from retribution and enslavement. The deal worked at first, but eventually her people were ultimately displaced, as were many other tribes, and some were enslaved as well. A tribal leader of the Navajo Nation, Annie Dodge Wanaka, was a different type of warrior. In 1951, she became the second woman ever elected to the tribal council. She spent her time on weekly radio broadcasts in the Navajo Nation about medical techniques such as vaccination. She eventually became the first Native American to get the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Wanaka was born in 1910 to the cliff-dwelling people of the Navajo tribe. She started her medical administrations at the age of 8 after surviving the flu. She then married and studied health, becoming an activist for the Navajo Nation. In 1918, the Spanish flu tore through the United States. The disease wreaked havoc throughout the already suffering Native American community. Thus, Wanaka's calling became to help the indigenous people learn more about health and public safety. Nanahi, or She Who Walks Among the Spirits, was a Cherokee woman born in 1738. Nanahi was influenced by her uncle, a Cherokee chief, to believe that the only way Native Americans would survive contact with the settlers was to coexist with them. She wanted to find ways to make peace between the people. When her husband was killed in a battle against Creek Nation, Nanahe took up his rifle and fought until they were victorious, earning herself the title of Beloved Woman. She would go on to be named the head of the Women's Council and given a place in the Cherokee General Council. She was the first woman to be given that honor, which led to one of her descendants, songwriter Becky Hobbs, to write a musical about her.
She's not only remembered as an iconic historical figure with the Cherokee people, but she's also a pioneer for women in American history.
Nanahe would eventually marry an Englishman and take his name, consequently taking the name Nancy Ward. She would continue to try her best to prevent violence between the Cherokee tribe and the settlers, once saving a woman from being burned alive and bringing her to her own home. Toward the end of her life, Nanahe began to believe that the settlers would continue to take more and more land and pleaded with her people not to give up any more of it, but her protests were fruitless and much of her native land was sold. She died in 1822, living a peaceful life as an innkeeper. Toiperina was only 25 when she inspired a revolt against the Spanish in 1785. Though many denied their role in the rebellion, Toiperina proudly admitted hers. She famously said to them, quote, "Of course I did it." A medicine woman of her tribe, Toiperina had become defiant after witnessing Spanish brutality against the natives. At the time, 5,000 of her people lived in what is now the San Gabriel Valley in California. Many of the Tongva were left without land as the Spanish took over much of the resources within the area. Further, many of the native Tongva were converted into the Spanish faith. Now called Gabrielinos, they were seen as enemies by some. Those who were not converted felt these new worshippers disrupted the Tongva's native way of life. Toiperina took it upon herself to ally 8 Tongva villages against the Spanish. They intended to kill the leaders, but they were betrayed and captured. 17 of them were whipped in public as a warning. Toiperina, along with other leaders, was held for questioning. She was eventually imprisoned for a year and a half. Today, a 60-foot mural honors her memory and bravery. During his life, Red Cloud played a crucial role in resisting white expansionism. Unfortunately, though, the story of the American West is a story with few happy endings. These are the tragic details about Red Cloud. Makpia Luta, also known as Red Cloud, was born around May 1821 near where the North and South Platte Rivers unite in what was considered Nebraska territory. His father was a Brule Lakota and his mother was an Oglala Lakota. Together, they belonged to a subdivision of the Oglala known as the Badface Band. There are conflicting accounts about Red Cloud's early life. According to Red Cloud, photographs of a Lakota chief, Red Cloud's father died of alcoholism when Red Cloud was young, and as a result, he was brought up by his mother's brother, known as Old Chief Smoke. But according to other accounts, Red Cloud's father survived until Red Cloud was 28 and died during a disagreement with Bear Bull, an Oglala leader. One of the earliest events in Red Cloud's life is relatively well documented, though. According to the autobiography of Red Cloud, when Red Cloud was 16, he joined a raid party against the Pawnee, who had recently slain his cousin. The raid was successful, and Red Cloud had soon made a name for himself after another successful ambush against the Crows. By 1850, Red Cloud had married Pretty Owl, also known as Lean Woman and Mary Goodroad, and they remained together until his death in 1909. She later died in 1940 at the assumed age of 104. Before the 1860s, the Sioux had relatively few contacts with white people, but once gold was discovered on their land, white people started flocking across the country. According to Representative Americans, the Civil War generation, the South Platte River Valley had seen an earlier gold rush in 1859, and once gold was found in Montana in 1862, the Bozeman Trail was promptly established. According to Northern Plains Reservation Aid, the Bozeman Trail was a pre-established trail that had been used for thousands of years by different native groups in North America. Such roads were incredibly common across the North American landscape prior to colonization, and according to an Indigenous people's history of the United States, the developed system of roads worked to the advantage of the European colonists. The Bozeman Trail also connected to the Oregon Trail, bringing hordes of miners and settlers right into the heart of the buffalo feeding grounds that were so vital to the native tribes of the Great Plains. As white settlers started moving down the trail, forts were built along the Bozeman Trail by the U.S. Army to protect the settlers, with little concern for the native inhabitants. Indeed, since the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty had established the area as a protected hunting land for the native tribes, the forts were clearly a treaty violation. In 1865, Red Cloud began leading a series of attacks against the white men on the Bozeman Trail that lasted until 1868. Known as Red Cloud's War, Red Cloud united the Lakota Sioux, Northern Arapaho, and the Northern Cheyenne against the white settlers, miners, and soldiers. During the war, the U.S. Army suffered one of their biggest military disasters at the Battle of the Hundred in the Hands on December 21, 1866. After Captain William Fetterman had boasted that he could easily pass through the Sioux Nation, Red Cloud planned an ambush. All 81 American soldiers ended up dead. Fiasco led the United States government to invite Red Cloud, along with more than 100 Native leaders, to discuss terms for a new treaty. The negotiations lasted for 2 years. In the end, though, Red Cloud negotiated the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which required the U.S. government to abandon several forts along the Bozeman Trail. It also established the Great Sioux Reservation and gave the Lakota possession over the western half of South Dakota, as well as parts of Wyoming and Montana Territory. It was a major victory for Red Cloud, but it wouldn't be long before the United States government started reneging on their obligations. In 1870, Red Cloud traveled to meet with President Ulysses S. Grant in Washington, D.C., which led to the establishment of the Red Cloud Agency, a reservation in Nebraska Territory for his tribe. However, it wasn't long before the United States government moved the Oglala Lakota while simultaneously carving up the Great Sioux Reservation. After General Custer found gold in the Black Hills in 1874, miners started flooding into Sioux territory once more. In 1875, Red Cloud traveled to Washington, D.C. with other Native leaders, once again to request the existing treaties be honored, but Congress tried negotiating a relocation of the Sioux instead. The Lakota leaders, including Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, refused this new arrangement, which led to the Great Sioux War of 1876 and the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand. Red Cloud was notably absent from the war, but his attempts to find a middle path backfired. Because of his absence, many Oglala considered him a traitor, while the American government accused him of conspiring with the other Native leaders anyway. After being established in 1871, the Red Cloud Agency was moved 4 times before the end of the decade, as the U.S. government slowly chipped away at the land that had been promised to Red Cloud and the other Native leaders. The loss of the Black Hills in 1876 was immeasurable and continues to be a point of contention between the Sioux and the United States government to this day. In the 1980s, the Supreme Court offered over $100 million to the Sioux as compensation for the Black Hills, but the Sioux refused the money, stating that, quote, "The payment is invalid because the land was never for sale, and accepting the funds would be tantamount to a sales transaction." The settlement remains in a trust and is now valued at over $1.3 billion, which the tribe refuses to accept.
That confiscation is illegal and that the tribes must have some of their ancestral lands returned to them.
When war didn't work, legislation was used instead. The Sioux Bill of 1889 carved the reservation into even smaller pieces, allowing white people to claim roughly 9 million acres of land that had been reserved for the Native people, or almost half of the reservation's original 20 million acres. On the reservation, Red Cloud quickly found that the promises made by the United States government were hollow. But at the same time, he ended up recruiting a most unlikely ally. According to Red Cloud and the Sioux Problem, in 1874, Red Cloud had made the acquaintance of Othniel C. Marsh, a notorious fossil hunter who was excavating in the Dakota Badlands. Marsh had to persuade Red Cloud that he was looking for fossils and not gold, but in the end, they became friends and allies. Red Cloud gave Marsh some coffee, tobacco, sugar, and flour to show the abysmal quality of the rations that were being distributed by the United States government, which led Marsh to file a complaint with the Board of Indian Commissioners, in addition to making a public statement about how the Sioux were being treated. In 1883, Red Cloud paid Marsh a visit in New Haven, Connecticut, and there's even a record of the two of them having kept up a correspondence. It said that Red Cloud referred to Marsh as Big Bone Chief. Although it's claimed that Red Cloud later stated that the samples he gave Marsh weren't representative, the investigation did actually lead the government into changing their contractors for flour and pork. They also replaced Dr. John J. Saville, the reservation agent at the time, for better or worse. In the 1880s, a white man by the name of Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy was assigned as the new government reservation agent for the Oglala Lakota. Though McGillicuddy had been a friend of Crazy Horse, he and Red Cloud clashed often. At the core of their dispute was the broader issue of assimilation, as the United States government enacted policies that forcefully stripped Native peoples of their cultural identity. Though he lobbied the government for better conditions and treatment of Native people, McGillicuddy ultimately saw himself as tasked with bringing civilization to the Oglala people, while Red Cloud fought to preserve their heritage, language, and culture. In particular, Red Cloud objected to Native children being sent away to boarding schools that provided an education, but also indoctrinated Native youth with American ideals. In 1880, McGillicuddy gathered a council of Sioux together and demanded that they renounce Red Cloud as their leader in an attempt to undermine Red Cloud's authority. At the same time, Red Cloud repeatedly criticized McGillicuddy over his mismanagement of government supplies and food meant for the reservation. And according to the Plain Sioux and U.S. colonialism from Lewis and Clark to Wounded Knee, other grievances included threats of withholding rations and suppression of the Sundance. The government, it turned out, had their own issues with McGillicuddy as they thought he was too sympathetic to Native causes. He was ultimately removed. In 1890, a new religious movement swept through the Native people. Called the ghost dance, practitioners believed that the proper execution of the dance ritual called the spirits of the dead to the living and would bring about a new era of peace and prosperity for all native peoples, in part by ending white expansion into the West. To ghost dancers, the movement symbolized the hope of a better future. To the US government, it was a dangerous rallying point for insurrection. And once again, Red Cloud was caught in the middle. Even though Red Cloud himself did not participate in the dance, his son did, leading some in the government to accuse Red Cloud of instigating dissension. Red Cloud responded by trying to break up the ghost dance. On December 10, 1890, Red Cloud wrote in a letter to Thomas A. Bland of the National Indian Defense Association, "I haven't been to see the dancing. I will try to stop it. Those Indians are fools. The winter weather will stop it, I think. Anyway, it will be over by spring. I don't think there will be any trouble. They say that I have been in the dance. That is not right. I have never seen it." Some historians believe that Red Cloud's stance was political rather than religious, and that he hoped to avoid violence by stopping the ghost dance. Sadly, his instincts proved to be all too correct. On December 15th, just 5 days after he wrote the letter, his fellow native leader Sitting Bull was killed by government agents attempting to break up the ghost dance. And on December 29th, US troops killed 153 Lakota, mostly women and children, at the infamous massacre at Wounded Knee. During the final years of his life, Red Cloud took on the name John and converted to Christianity. Having become blind by the end of his life, his wife Pretty Owl assisted him until Red Cloud died at the age of 88 at Pine Ridge Reservation on December 10, 1909. According to biography, Red Cloud outlived most of his contemporary native leaders. However, by the end of his life, Red Cloud had lost much of his influence, especially after McGillicuddy was successful in having him deposed as a leader. Still, he had also become one of the most famous native people in the world, in large part due to the many photographs of him that were widely distributed. He posed in dozens of photos, sometimes dressed in his normal clothing and other times wearing the costume of the colonizer. Overall, there are at least 128 known photographs of Red Cloud. The book Red Cloud, Photographs of Lakota Chiefs, suggests that Red Cloud used photography as a way to enhance his reputation and thus his political influence. Before Red Cloud died, he was visited by an anthropologist. Red Cloud lamented the poor state of affairs. Even though the government had promised to provide food for Native people, they were forced to beg in order to receive anything, in part because the land they had been moved to was much less habitable than their traditional lands. He said, "I wish there was someone to help my poor people when I am gone." Unfortunately, this hasn't yet happened. Starting in 2016, the Lakota Oyate and the Dakota Oyate of the Standing Rock Reservation began protesting the construction of an oil pipeline, with many claiming that the pipeline was a treaty violation if it passed through native land, in addition to citing the various health risks associated with living near the pipeline. The protests were once again met with violence from local and federal government, which deployed the National Guard to disperse protesters. Private security firms even unleashed attack dogs.
Our ancestors, they went through a terrible time in their lifetime, and right now they can't even rest at peace because of the destruction of the pipeline.
The legal battle continues in court, but more than a century after Red Cloud's death, the outcome so far seems to be the same.
The people who lived in pre-American Alaska had to learn how to survive in a harsh and inhospitable landscape. It was often cold, but it was often beautiful, abundant, and challenging. Here's everything you didn't know about life in pre-American Alaska. When you picture the Ice Age in your mind, you probably imagine a land choked by glaciers and very little, if any, green. How exactly does one survive in a land with nothing but ice? It turns out that common perception is actually a misperception. According to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the interior of Alaska was actually green during the last Ice Age. While it's true that parts of the future state were locked up in ice, the interior was actually something of a paradise. That's because so much of the world's oceans were frozen that the sea level dropped by about 400 feet, exposing the Bering Land Bridge and briefly connecting Alaska and Siberia. All that land actually helped to further isolate the Alaskan interior from the ocean moisture, which in turn led to warm summers and relatively mild winters.
Unusual weather we're having, ain't it?
More than 11,000 years ago, two mothers buried their babies in the cold ground of their fishing camp in what is now modern Alaska. The infants were placed on a red ochre and surrounded by hunting darts made out of antlers. The care with which they were buried reminds us that ancient people loved and grieved just as we still do today, and they also gave archaeologists important insight into the genetic origins of Native Americans. One of the two babies was between 6 and 12 weeks old, and the other was likely stillborn. They were buried in the same ceremonial fashion, but they were from two very different genetic lineages, neither of which are common to the modern population of Native Americans. This means that the people who lived in Alaska 11,500 years ago were a lot more genetically diverse than previously believed.
This finding seems to support the theory that the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge must have been isolated from their Siberian ancestors for a very long period of time.
The people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge during and soon after the Ice Age would have seen animals that are familiar to today's Alaskans, like the bighorn sheep and elk. But as they moved into the interior, they would have encountered creatures that would turn modern humans into terrified piles of quivering bear food. The early settlers likely shared territory with animals that we can only imagine, such as woolly mammoths, American lions, and the giant short-faced bear. That last one was about 12 feet tall when standing upright, and therefore about 4 to 7 feet larger than a grizzly bear and probably not very afraid of humans. It turns out that early Alaskans actually hunted mammoth, mastodons, and other large animals, and some researchers think they even had a hand in those animals' eventual extinction. The fossil record suggests that the decline of these species correlated with the migration of humans from Thuringia into North America. Others, though, believe it was mostly climate change that was to blame. As the region warmed, the scrub tundra spread to the steppe and outcompeted the vegetation that larger herbivores depended on. Whatever the reason for the extinction, it's still cool that human beings once looked out across the land and saw massive herds of mammoths, and sad to know that no one will ever see that again. Most scholars of ancient history agree that agriculture was the key to human civilization. Once people learned how to grow food and raise domesticated animals, they could build permanent settlements because there would no longer be the need to follow migrating herds or move on once all the roots had been gathered. Estimates of the beginning of agriculture typically place it around 12,000 years ago. But in Alaska, there's no significant tradition of farming. Instead, there's evidence that people were setting up permanent villages around the same time that they were harvesting very large amounts of food. For example, evidence for things like plank house construction and permanent hearths start to appear in the archaeological record around 5,200 years ago. By 3,200 years ago, it's clear that people were skilled at building large wooden fish weirs for the massed harvest of salmon. According to the Alaskan Department of Natural Resources, these developments were followed by things like fortification, which suggests that villages were sometimes targeted by other clans. Clearly, with civilization comes other people who are jealous of that civilization. So the native Alaskans really weren't so different from any other human civilization anywhere ever.
Alaska, a place where you can't be too fat or too drunk, where no one says things like, "Let's see your high school equivalency certificate."
Whaling today has a very bad reputation, mostly because large commercial whaling operations have been responsible for driving many species to the brink of extinction. But for a lot of native Alaskan people, whales were an important resource. And the history of whaling in the area goes back at least 2,500 years, when the tribes of the Bering Sea were hunting whales in small kayaks or boats made of walrus hide. The hunters would wound their prey with a harpoon and then sometimes follow it for days until it finally died. If that sounds awful, just try to remember how harsh the living conditions were for these ancient hunters and how many meals one whale could represent. Nowadays, whales are still a major source of food for the Inuit people, and for some cultures, the hunt is more about tradition than about subsistence. Either way, the practice is now controversial, and like so much of what made pre-American Alaska special, it may one day become nothing more than a memory of the past.